So we're going to do the first module today, which is an overview. And as I said in the introduction, the overview, I don't want to spend too much time on certain areas. I just want to touch on a range of relevant areas that we'll be following through the semester. So it's an overview of air freight transport. Some of the questions that we'll be seeking to answer through the course of this particular day are: what are the main parts of the aviation industry? How is aviation and the air cargo important to the global economy? Who are the main global aviation bodies? Who are the main stakeholders in the air freight transport industry? What are the main types of air cargo carriers? When is air cargo the most desirable shipment option? What are the main factors that determine the viability of the air freight transport industry? And who are the main Australian regulatory bodies? And where is Australia's main air cargo markets by country and by region? Our readings will come from probably the three main e-texts that you'll be able to access through the course of the semester, and you'll find I'll take a lot of the content from there, and that's Morel, Wensveen and Sales. And there's also another reading there which is talking about international freight movements through Australian airports. So I thought I juggled my slides up a little bit, and I thought a really good place to start in regards to today was just the importance of aviation generally to the global economy. Now, according to industry body Air Transport Action Group, some of the key facts about the aviation industry generally are that in terms of value, 3.6% of the global GDP comes from aviation. And if you were equating that to an output, that would be the output similar to Switzerland. So quite a significant amount of value associated with aviation. And if you were ranking it in terms of countries, it would probably sit around about 20th in the world in terms of gross domestic product. So in other words, final goods and services produced. So it's generating around about that $700 billion of GDP per year. Air transport supports about 65 million jobs, and 10 million of those jobs are working directly in aviation themselves. And I guess it's only when you have a look at the scope of the industry that you get a strong sense of the magnitude of the industry itself. So 1,300 airlines, 31,000 aircraft are flown, 45,000 routes to facilitate the movement of passengers and cargo, almost 3,800 airports and 170 air navigation service providers. So it's certainly a significant industry, global industry. A little bit more specific to the air transport industry in terms of air cargo, and this comes from the International Air Transport Association, IATA. And what they say is that in terms of the volume of international trade carried, air transport carries about 1%. So in relative terms, that's quite small. 90% of the volume of international trade is actually carried by sea. So it's relatively small in that context. But when you look at the value of international trade shipped by air is 35% of the total value of trade that's facilitated. And that equates to about 9% of airline revenues on average. So the value of goods carried by airlines exceed around 6 trillion per year. In 2017, after quite a number of years that were very mediocre in terms of air cargo growth, we saw a significant rise in air cargo growth at 9.7%. 2017. In many ways, it just came out of a situation where the previous year had been quite low. So it was quite a surprise to most people. However, the following year, the expectation was that it was going to drop back a little bit. There were some issues in regards to China and the United States. So the forecasted cargo volume of around about 4.5%, amounting to about 62 million tonnes. As it turned out, it only grew 3.5%. So that global unease about trade between US and China certainly contributed to that. However, along comes December last year. US and China are still at loggerheads in terms of their issues that they were having. IATA forecast it would grow this year 3.7%, quite a conservative figure, but still within the expectations. Cargo revenue would increase about 5%. However, this year it's been quite lacklustre. IATA have already downgraded the growth projection from 3.7% to 2%. So, you know, to use an analogy, you would say that air cargo is currently facing some strong headwinds, and month on month what we're seeing is the dropping of air cargo. Now, it's not only the issues going on between China and the US, certainly is not helping, but it's also been almost 10 years since there's been any significant global recession. So that is also perhaps weighing down a number of people in terms of their forward projections. So I'm going to leave that there. I wanted to talk about a couple of the main global aviation bodies. The first one I want to talk about is ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organisation. So this particular organisation was established in 1944, and it coincided with a significant convention that was held in the United States, the Convention on International Civil Aviation. And essentially that convention enshrined the laws, the rules, the regulations of flight globally, how to license, the licensing of aircraft, the movement of aircraft across countries. So it's quite a significant event in time. 54 countries were involved in that particular process. And I think the interesting thing about it, if nothing else, there are a lot of interesting things, but if you look at that date, 1944, the Second World War had yet to be completed. However, you had a collective agreement around the globe that there needed to be some certainty around the idea of aeroplanes flying around the globe. So ICAO, this organisation that was established in 1944, effectively they manage and administer that particular convention. So that's their task. Essentially what they do, in that convention are a range of standards and recommended practices. When the convention was enshrined, there were 15 what they call annexes, which are areas of discussion and agreement by the parties involved. That's since grown to 19 over time. At the time of enshrining this body of work, it wasn't law in any country around the globe. Essentially, the countries that signed up then had to go back to their own government and convince them to come on board with these rules and regulations. And effectively, that's what ICAO does. It works with governments around the globe to ensure that there is a form of conformity to global norms. Now, much in terms of their direction and objectives is based around this idea of a safe, efficient, secure and economically sustainable aviation sector. So you'll find that phrase in a number of different bodies. In addition to this oversight of the convention itself and working with governments, it's also mindful that some governments don't necessarily have the resources to implement these laws themselves. So they work a lot closely with developing countries and countries that are that need a level of support. They also undertake the planning phase in terms of where aviation is going. So they do global plans, particularly around things like safety and regulation. But they also provide probably the most number of performance metrics in terms of how the industry is going and forecasts. And that helps all manner of people make determinations about what they're going to do in the industry. Another body that was formed around about that same time in 1945 is IATA, the International Air Transport Association. Now, this is a little bit different, a fair bit different if you like, from the previous one, and that is that it's the trade association for airlines. So over 80% of airlines are signed up to IATA, and they've got a collective voice when they're having conversations with ICAO and government. And once again, they are seeking to operate safely, securely, efficiently and economically, which is very consistent with what ICAO's ideals are as well. I guess the main difference with an organisation like IATA, and you would expect it, they're representing the interests of airlines. So their strategic focus are on things that improve the lot, they improve the performance of airlines. So it's regulatory and legal environment. It's reducing airport and navigation charges and fuel fees and things like that. It's also working with ICAO. One of the things that ICAO will do is that it will have a number of working groups on key topics. So this particular agenda that ICAO has is carbon neutral growth. IATA have fed into that particular one. Removing barriers to commercialisation of sustainable aviation fuels, and a couple of other things that are more pertinent to the operational aspects of airlines. The third one I just wanted to mention was ATAG, which is the Air Transport Action Group. Now ATAG takes on a range of different agendas above the operational issues. So some of those esoteric sort of areas, some of those aspects that deal with the promotion of aviation globally. It's got 50 members, and I guess the difference about this particular group is that it's a group which is made of a collective of airlines, air manufacturers, tourism operators, service providers, ground transportation. So it's a different type of group. They've got a different type of agenda, and their priority ideas is keeping the industry together, a level of industry collaboration. So it's that single voice. Now the single voice works really well when you're dealing with ICAO, when you're dealing with other governments on a range of different agendas. So they've got their own agenda. Climate change is top of mind, industry communications, and putting a positive spin, if you like. I don't like using the word spin, but putting a positive look on the industry and extolling the virtues and economic benefits of aviation, sustainable development and sustainable aviation fuels. Now, ICAO have got a definition of civil aviation, and essentially what they say is that it's made up of three main areas. The first area is that commercial air transport services, which you can see up here. Second area is general aviation, which is down here, covers a few things there. And then it's got a range of other different types of services. For the purpose of our work this particular semester, we're going to focus on the first one, which is by far and away the largest single element of civil aviation, and that's commercial air transport services. And as the name suggests, it's anything to do with the aviation industry that's of a commercial nature. So that could be both scheduled and unscheduled passenger service or all cargo services, and it could be non-scheduled services along the lines of charter and on-demand services. So the focus of this particular unit is going to be on this particular area, but specific to air freight transport, and essentially all the stakeholders that make up the air freight transport industry. We're going to discuss and we're going to talk about it. And it's just those parties that are involved in the movement of air cargo. It's just worth mentioning that general aviation is that probably the second largest area there, and that just refers to any form of aviation that's not of a commercial air transport activity. So it could be agricultural work, it could be construction, photography, aerial advertisement, search and rescue, surveying. It also includes a range of non-commercial business, recreation and sports activity. I wanted to, I guess one of the things about the aviation industry is that there's a whole lot of different definitions and terms and references, which is quite different than anything that you might find, say, for argument's sake, in the aviation industry. So I just wanted to share a couple of those with you now. There's many, many more, and as you go through the semester, it's just worth keeping a note of those, just to make sure you've got a good understanding of that. The first one I want to mention is air cargo. Now, in many ways, air cargo is a bit of a generic term, in the same way that air freight is a bit of a generic term. But if you really look to the, and I will be saying air freight from time to time, I'll be saying air cargo from time to time, but if you went right down into the heart of it, they actually are subtly different in some ways, and when it needs to be subtly different, I'll point out the way. But air cargo are air cargo services, which is essentially the movement of products both domestically and internationally by an air carrier. That seems pretty straightforward. So essentially, these are products carried on a commercial passenger or all-cargo freighter aircraft. Yep. Now, there are types of air cargo. One's called air express, one's called air freight, and then we've got air mail. We're not going to get hung up on this along the way, but I'm just giving you an indication that you can unpack some of these definitions, although we'll probably be using it in a more general sense. So if we're specifically talking about something that's air express, this refers to small packages and parcels. So those sort of parcels that you might see over there, that's air express. So generally they have a high priority than other types of freight. Generally there's an overnight delivery, is often guaranteed. And typically the scheduling approach is to feed these parcels into a hub and then moving it out from a hub from there. It usually involves door-to-door service. So that's air express. Now, air express is typically carried by an operator who's called an integrator or express carrier. So if you come across that term integrator, you then know that they're somebody who's carrying air express. And these goods, this air express, is only generally carried on a freighter aircraft. And a freighter aircraft is an aircraft that doesn't have passengers on the top level. So when we refer to a freighter aircraft, we're talking to an aircraft that's not carrying passengers. If we're talking about an all-cargo aircraft, that's an aircraft that doesn't have any passengers. Now, at any time, I'm happy to take any questions if there's any uncertainty. Air freight. Now, air freight is the shipment of medium to large air freight products. They may be urgent or they may not. They usually require some form of consolidation. So when we use the term consolidation, it just usually means repacking into a more consolidated container, to a full container, if you like. Sometimes it might require special handling services, and usually much of the goods that are carried in air freight are on unit load devices, or ULDs. An air service can be provided by passenger or all cargo aircraft. So that's our air freight. So, and to be fair, that's probably 90% of the goods that are moved around in air cargo are going to be air freight. And the third one's air mail. And as the name suggests, it refers to mail items shipped by air. Very small percentage, certainly changed over time. Letters and envelopes, which are essentially channeled through postal services. An aircraft provided by passenger or all cargo freighter aircraft. Usually these, the contracts for air mail are with the integrators. So that's air cargo. So you get a general idea of what air cargo. I mentioned unit load device. So unit load device are constructed of aluminium. It's very light, and usually it's constructed in a way to fit quite economically into the below the body of an aircraft. It's usually a standard size, and it's actually enabled to maximise that space by having these particular unit load devices in aircraft. So the efficient use of available state. So that's the cut through of there. So as you can see, they just sit in there nicely like that. So that's your unit load device. Over the years, these unit load devices have got a lot more sophisticated. They can carry animals. They can carry any form of perishable product, flowers, for example. And that's an example of what that might look like. The third little definition I wanted to share with you was hub airport. So in your reading, you'll come across a hub airport. And essentially, it's a centrally located transshipment terminal where smaller aircraft will deliver their cargo into that particular terminal. That will then be transferred to a larger long-haul flight which will go on to its final destination. This particular view that we can see there, this is the FedEx hub, which operates out of Memphis. And if you put a circle around it, notionally you can get a sense that you've got the hub in the middle and you've got a number of spokes that make up that hub, and hence the term coined hub and spoke system. Now, the last one, I just put this in today, and I thought it was pretty useful, just to, and it wasn't to get a smile out of Ryan, which I've been able to achieve that. So we go an extra step in this class, Ryan. There's an opportunity to actually draw on the board.
Yeah, don't worry, I did last year. I did not last year, last
Yeah, no, I did. Well, a couple of years ago, I managed to get somebody to draw a plane for me. So, anyway, look, the point I want to make here is that in terms of coming up with a measure of volume for international freight, the term is freight tonnes per kilometre, or FTK. And that's the accepted measure of air freight traffic. So to get a sense of the growth or decline of freight globally, it's based on freight tonnes per kilometre. And it captures both the weight and distance of the movement of air freight. So freight tonnes per kilometre equals the revenue load flown by the kilometres flown. So as you can see here, you've got the goods being prepared and ready for at the airport and then moved into the belly hold of the plane. So freight tonnes per kilometre is the 1 metric tonne of revenue load carried 1 kilometre. So each one of those, the cumulative number of those, so the sum of the freight tonnes per kilometre for every flight stage flown by every aircraft over the period is the freight tonnes per kilometre of the airline. Everybody comfortable with freight tonnes per kilometre? Okay. All right, now I mentioned to you that the main focus for what we'll be talking about is a range of different things associated with the air freight transport industry. And it's the stakeholders involved in that air freight transport industry. And this slide gives you an indication of many of those stakeholders. So through the course of the semester, we'll be talking about airlines, freight forwarders, integrators, airports, government, because they've got a role to play not only with regulation but also through customs, aircraft manufacturers, trading enterprises, so the shipper and the consignee, warehousing, terminal operation and ground handling. Another area I wanted to touch on was to give you a sense of who the air cargo carriers are around the globe. So in an effort to segment air cargo carriers, we can come up with about 6 main groups of carriers that carry air cargo. The first group is what we can call scheduled all-cargo carriers. Now, bearing in mind, all-cargo is also another name for freighter, so scheduled freighter carriers. Now, a scheduled freighter carrier is a freighter aircraft only specialised in the carriage of air cargo. So, in other words, no passengers, just air cargo. And that's that particular group there. And some of the companies involved there are Nippon Cargo, Airbridge Cargo, Polar Air Cargo and Cargo Lux. The second group of air cargo carriers are what we call charter cargo carriers. Now these are a freighter fleet again, so all cargo carriers, but they don't have a scheduled network. So they're working on the basis of demand. And we can see them there. And those two airlines that we're looking at there, Antonov Airlines and Volga-Depna, they have some of the largest aircraft in the world. So when we're talking about completely oversized goods, those are the operators that they bring in for those type of requirements. The third type of air cargo carrier is the integrated carrier. Now I mentioned before about express cargo, that's the integrated carrier. So it's a freighter fleet with scheduled and unscheduled services. So UPS, FedEx, DHL are the main operators in that particular area. The fourth area is ACMI providers. Now, ACMI providers operate freighter or passenger aircraft on behalf of other airlines. ACMI is an acronym. I could have easily had that in a definition, but there you go. And it stands for Aircraft, Crew, Maintenance and Insurance. So if you're an airline and you've got some increased capacity and you don't want to make an investment in a new aircraft, you might contact one of those guys and get them to operate a particular segment on your behalf. The two main operators we can see there are Atlas Air and Air Atlantica Icelandic. Once again, freighters. So all the ones that I've spoken about thus far deal with freighter aircraft. There's a little bit of passenger aircraft in the ACMI. Combination carriers are airlines that operate passenger aircraft and also air cargo aircraft, so passenger and freighter. And combination carriers, we're looking at Emirates, Lufthansa, Cathay Pacific, LATAM. And the final one are passenger airlines. Passenger airlines also carry cargo, and these are airlines that operate passenger aircraft. And those airlines, Delta, American, British Airlines and Swiss. And the subtle difference between a combination carrier and a passenger carrier is that the combination carriers just have some additional freighters. They put more of an emphasis on the carriage of air cargo. So that's just the subtle difference between those two there. The combination carriers and the passenger carriers are carrying the majority of air cargo around the globe. So if we look at some statistics there, all cargo carriers are carrying about 12% just of air cargo that's carried around the globe. Integrators are carrying about 8%. So about 20% of cargo which is carried around the globe are carried by freighter-only type companies. Passenger airlines take an equivalent amount of air cargo. They also carry 20% of air cargo. And by far and away, the most cargo is carried by combination carriers, 29% of which is carried on freighter and 31% on passenger. So if you roughly add those both together, what you end up with is that air cargo carried around the globe is half is carried on passenger airlines and the other half is carried on freighter airlines. So how does air freight transport itself stack up with other modes? So moving goods by air stack up against other modes. Now typically that decision-making process when it comes down to it in regards to air freight or to use a different mode has got a lot to do with the characteristics of the commodity itself. Also the stated demand for the product itself, and whether there's an existence of any distribution problems. And another area that impacts on the choice of air cargo is the emergence of global value chains. So ultimately, that choice of transport mode is generally going to be, of course, between those four options, mindful that in many ways air transport is a multimodal type of product. It can't exist on its own, and in many ways you're actually looking for combinations between truck and air, rail and air, road and air, and sea and air. So when is air cargo the most desirable option? Well, one of the main reasons why air cargo is a desirable option has to do with the type of commodity that it is itself. So if you've got a perishable commodity, That's a product that needs to go from the shipper to the exporter to the importer quite quickly. Particularly fresh food, agricultural, pharmaceutical type products, they need to have special storage. That's one of the main reasons why air cargo is chosen. Another reason why air cargo can be the most desirable option is that if the product itself is subject to quick obsolescence. So things such as newspapers, magazines, they lose their saleability after a number of days. So that's a suggestion that those goods have to get into the market reasonably quickly. In addition to that, of course, also is that if you've got fashionable items, you want those fashionable items to arrive in the market quite quickly, so you can take advantage of that window of opportunity. Now, if you've got a product that's required at short notice, the speed that air cargo can deliver is another reason why it makes it desirable. So if you've got a critical short-term requirement around spare parts or documents, then air cargo is going to be an appropriate method of getting your products into the marketplace. Another reason why you might use air cargo has got to do with how valuable the product is. So if this is a product that's very valuable to weight, in other words, which could easily be gold, jewellery, it could be goods that might be artworks, for example, luxury vehicles, all sorts of things, but that are very valuable, then all of a sudden moving those goods there quickly make a reasonable idea. And the other characteristic of a commodity that might encourage you to use for air cargo is that if it's very expensive to handle and store. So if you've got some particular goods that require special handling, it's the sort of product that you will find that air cargo can deliver a particular customised option for you and minimise breakages. Another reason why air cargo is and can be the most desirable option can have something to do with the stated demand for the product itself. So if the stated demand's unpredictable, and this can often happen with technologically based products or innovative products or fashion-based products, so you're not really sure when those products are going to be needed into the marketplace. When the time comes, you might need to get those products in the market quite quickly, and obviously air cargo can deliver on that for you. If the stated demand for those products are infrequent, so, and this is around the idea of short life cycles, so you might have a seasonality aspect around the products. It could have to do with the type of agricultural product that needs to go into the market with a short space of time. Then air cargo is going to provide that opportunity for you. Mindful that it's going to be more appropriate for goods that are of high value rather than low value, because you probably couldn't justify sending in low value goods into the marketplace in all cases. If there's a high demand for the products, so you want to get your products into the market quickly, and there's limited local supply, you want to take advantage of that demand, where air cargo can provide that opportunity for you. Seasonality I touched on before, so that cyclical nature of that window of opportunity might only be 3 months for Tasmanian cherries to have an opportunity in China, so that 250 tonnes of Tasmanian cherries will use air to move into the Chinese market. Another reason why air cargo is often the most desirable form of movement is if there's issues in regards to the distribution. So distribution being the supply chain of getting those goods into the marketplace. So if there's a chance that the goods might be pilfered, if they might be broken into, generally you find air cargo is a more secure and safer option of moving your goods into the marketplace. You've got greater security, and it's in the air for a shorter period of time. One of the other aspects of goods which are having long periods of transit is that insurance costs can go up. So with air cargo, you can get your product to the marketplace reasonably instantaneous, so you can minimise your insurance costs, and that might work in your favour. Substantially lower than surface transport. Heavy and expensive packaging is often not required when you're moving by air, something that you would most likely need for sea, and that's mainly due to that you don't have the affected by the same jolts and shocks as those goods are moving from one market to another. And of course, if there is a need for special handling and care, once again, customised options can be delivered in that regard, and of course the unit load device can provide a level of high protection. Another thing that I guess businesses are going to work out is that we know that holding large inventories of goods in warehouses comes at a cost. So instead of holding costs of goods in a warehouse, instead of holding goods in a warehouse for a period of time, you can deliver those goods relatively quickly as required in a just-in-time type of approach by air, so that you might be able to make some cost economies along the way. And the other aspect where I guess air cargo has become that desirable option is because it fits very nicely into this idea of a global value chain. Now, global value chain is this idea that various locations around the globe are producing intermediate goods, which are goods that go into that final product when it's finally assembled. And generally, to make that business model work, you need an efficient movement of goods around the globe until it gets to the final assembly point. And air cargo can deliver those opportunities. The approach to the production of the product and the reason why businesses take advantage of these global value chains is often it might be a low-cost destination, it might be access to particular types of resources, or it could be an opportunity for a certain level of expertise. However, to make that all work, as I said before, you need efficient logistics. Now, the World Trade Organisation states that round about now, most goods that are put together around the globe use global value chain. About 50% of global trade is to do with global value chain, and that's up around about 15% in the last 20 years. So international movements of these type of goods are going to be matched quite well with the idea of movement by air cargo. An example of a product that has a global value chain is smartphones. Various elements of smartphones are made from all parts of the globe. There's 24 major components with various complexities. So you've got high complexity, medium complexity and low complexity. It can be as limited as plastic shell, or it could be a memory chip. So as you have a look here, it's not surprisingly that most of the high-end parts are dominated by Korea, Japan and the United States that you can see up there. Although interestingly down here you also see the United States there. So for this all to work, these goods have got to move around the globe and come together Usually they're in other countries than where the goods are actually manufactured, and the main assembly points for smartphones: Brazil, China, Chinese Taipei, India, Korea, Japan and Malaysia. And that's all pulled together by a movement by air in many cases. Probably the classic example of a global value chain that relates to aviation, and it is the Boeing 787. So for this particular aircraft, we've got this is Boeing, obviously a United States company. They've got a number of manufacturing facilities in the United States. They've got facilities in Japan, Italy, England, France, China, Australia, before it comes together and assembled in that point of the United States. So that's effectively all held together by the movement of goods by virtue of air cargo. As I said before, air freight is, by its pure and simple nature, a multimodal type of service. And that's mainly because you don't have your manufacturing plants or your consumers located at the airport itself. And when we talk about multimodal, what we're really talking about here we're talking about goods that are moving through a number of different transport providers, and typically a multimodal being one which is under a contract of a single carrier. Could be intermodal, which is a similar type of idea, but you have different carriers. It's not under a single carrier, it's under different carriers along the way. So it's highly unusual that you would be using air transport just for one single element of a particular journey. When we talk about multimodal and mixing air, we're talking about truck and air, we're talking about sea and air, we're talking about rail and air, and any sort of combination of that. Truck and air, I think, is pretty straightforward. It's that idea of utilising truck to move the goods from the shipper to the airport. It could be consolidated there, repacked, or it could be ready to go on the aircraft, getting to the final destination in the airport and then being shipped out from there. It's pretty straightforward. Can't say too much more about that. In Europe, it's a lot more sophisticated. Certainly in Europe, there's a lot more use of surface travel, so trucks, and they even go to the point of registering trucks under their own flight numbers of particular aircraft to expand their network outside their airport bases. It could involve the pick-up and delivery and drop-off and delivery of goods, similar to the integrators. In the United States, it's a little bit different. They have different types of aircraft, and they don't rely so much on trucks and surface travel. They typically will rely on air freight for most of the movement of a lot of the cargo in that particular country. Now, sea and air, this is where it gets a little bit more interesting. With sea and air, it presents a pretty good opportunity for a business. If you're going to take up the sea air option, you're taking that option because it presents an opportunity probably to save some money. So if you've got a long journey, the sea and air option might be a good option to you to part move the shipment by air and move the rest of the shipment by sea. Now, where it doesn't work so well is when in economically hard time, because I guess what we know is that air freight generally is high. But when economically hard times are here, such as the global financial crisis, you've got the air freight rates coming right down. So the idea of swapping over to sea really didn't make a real advantage in that particular scenario. To make air and sea work really well, you almost need an operation that is able to transfer the containers from air into a shipping type of containers. Now, that's not a seamless operation, so you need a well efficient handling operation to actually do that. And for that to work also, you need a nearby container port, and you need efficient transshipment facilities. So it doesn't suit all purposes, but it can work very well. It's worked very well in the Middle East for this type of approach. Now, in 2010, taking up this sea-air option presented you with an opportunity to save about a third of the cost of moving those goods to that destination. So 30% cheaper than just doing it straight air. So that is quite a considerable saving. I suppose the other thing that you balance that out with is the fact that it does take a significant amount longer. So it's going to take you something like 13 days to get to that long haul destination. If you were sending your goods there directly, it would probably take you 2 to 3 days. And if you were sending it just by sea, it's taking you around about 18 to 22 days. So I guess it's just that the determination of what your situation that you find yourself in. However, this sea-air idea can work in situations where you've got short economic cycles. Now, I said before, if you've got a short economic cycle, you need to get the product into the market there pretty quickly. However, that just might be the first level of shipments, and you might be shipping for the next 6 months. So what you might end up doing is that the first shipment goes by air, the second shipment might by sea air, and the third shipment is by sea. So you're mitigating your costs by just taking that different sort of approach. To give you a sense of those sea-air combinations, there's a multitude of options that you've got available to you, whether it's eastbound or in a western destination between Asia and Europe. So between Asia and Europe, the main, actually that's between Asia and the United States. So forget, oh no, sorry, just had a moment there. So this is between Asia and Europe, eastbound and westbound. The main eastbound combinations are somewhere in Eastern Asia, so it could be, for example, Japan, on to Vancouver, Seattle or Los Angeles by sea, and then from there directly into Europe. So that would be an example of using a sea-air combination, or down to South America, just depending on when you're sending the goods. Another sea-air combination would be westbound, so you're going back the other way. And this would be, once again, Northeast Asia to Singapore by sea, Singapore to Europe by air, so from here, and then from Singapore into somewhere like Berlin. So that's this sea-air combination. Takes longer, but it can reduce the costs associated with moving the goods into those particular regions. Another option there is Northeast Asia into Sharjah by sea, and then Sharjah to Europe by air. So as you can see here, working your way down through Japan, up through there, onto there, and then down into there, and then going on to Europe. So these are the combinations that are available that might mitigate some of the costs associated with those movement of goods. From the 2000, multimodal usage has been in favour of westbound combinations that benefit from attractive rates moving into Europe. Okay, so as we've seen, that decision-making process that goes into the determination of whether air freight is desirable is around the demand for the product. It's what type of product there is. It's whether there's any distribution issues. There's some other issues that go into it as well, and they include things such as that determination around cost versus delivery time. So if delivery time cost is a contentious issue, certainly with air freight. It's something that they have to deal with, and they really can't move away from it. If you need your goods into a market quickly, you've got to come up with the funds to take advantage of paying for those high freight rates. And I guess the reality is that the freight rates associated with air cargo can be 10 to 15 times more than you might be associated with other ways of moving those goods. So it's an expensive option, but there might be some savings that you can take advantage of along the way in terms of packaging costs, which you might minimise a little bit. You might be able to reduce your costs on the insurance premiums. Now, I mentioned before that carrying an inventory is also a cost. So one of the ways of minimising that carrying of inventory in a particular market, rather than carrying a buffer in an international market, you might take advantage of just sending the goods by air at the appropriate time. Also in favour is air, and I've mentioned that before, is that for some items they need to get into the marketplace quickly. That life cycle, that perishable products and obsolescence of fashionable products need to get there quickly, so air works in their favour. One aspect I didn't mention, and that is that most of business that's done internationally typically is done in some form of credit. Not in all cases, but most of it's done on credit. So that credit typically starts from the point of time that the person who's buying the goods receives them. So I guess the argument goes that if you can get those goods into the hands of the buyer as soon as possible, that's going to reduce the amount of time before you get that final payment. And that might help you out with cash flows and issues like that. Ultimately, whatever decision that you make around the table in terms of what mode that you choose might be enshrined in the contract of sale. That contract of sale is going to specify the method of delivery,